The first golden light of early autumn filtered through the towering pine trees of Yellowstone National Park. After several days of heavy rain, the sky had finally cleared, leaving the forest sparkling beneath the morning sun. The crisp mountain air carried the scent of damp earth and fresh pine, while tiny drops of water still clung to every branch. Ranger Daniel Brooks, a 40-year-old National Park ranger with nearly 2 decades of experience, slowly drove his Green Ranger pickup toward the remote region known as Black Pine Ridge. Very few visitors ever came this far into the park. Sitting quietly in the passenger seat was his loyal partner, Max. The 6-year-old German Shepherd stared through the window with alert, amber eyes. His ears stood tall, listening to every sound hidden within the forest. Daniel smiled. "Looks like an easy patrol today, buddy." Max gave a small wag of his tail, but never looked away from the trees. Their assignment was simple. Inspect the hiking trails after the recent storm, clear any dangerous obstacles, and make sure no campers had wandered into restricted areas. When the dirt road finally ended, Daniel parked the truck. From there, only a narrow footpath disappeared into the forest. He adjusted his backpack, checked his radio and GPS, and nodded toward Max. "Let's go." The German Shepherd jumped down and immediately took the lead. The forest was unusually peaceful. Birds sang from the treetops. A small group of deer crossed the trail ahead before quietly disappearing into the woods. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Then Max suddenly stopped. He lifted his head and sniffed the air. Instead of following the trail, he turned sharply into the dense forest. "Max," Daniel called calmly. The dog didn't hesitate. He continued walking between the towering pines. Daniel glanced at his GPS. There were no marked trails in that direction. Normally, Max never left a patrol route without a reason. Daniel had learned long ago to trust his partner's instincts. "All right, show me what you found." For nearly 10 minutes, they pushed through thick ferns and fallen branches. The trees grew closer together, blocking much of the sunlight. The forest became strangely quiet. Then Max stopped. Daniel stepped beside him. His eyes widened. Hidden among the ancient pines stood an old wooden cabin. Its roof was covered with thick green moss. Part of the roof had collapsed long ago. Wild vines climbed across the weathered walls, and every window was hidden beneath layers of dust and dirt. It looked as though nature had been slowly reclaiming the building for decades. Daniel stared in disbelief. He had patrolled Yellowstone for years, yet he had never seen this cabin before. He opened the park's digital map on his tablet. The GPS placed them exactly where they were standing, but there was no building marked anywhere. He checked again. Nothing. "That's impossible." Slowly, Daniel walked toward the front porch. A broken wooden sign leaned against one of the steps. He brushed away the moss with his glove. Only a few faded words remained. "Ranger, cabin." The rest had disappeared beneath time and weather. Meanwhile, Max quietly circled the cabin. He sniffed every corner before stopping in front of the main door. Daniel joined him. The heavy wooden door was still standing. So was the old iron lock. Rust covered every inch of its surface, yet there wasn't a single mark showing that anyone had ever forced it open. Daniel looked around carefully. No footprints, no litter, no recent signs of human activity. The forest had completely hidden the cabin from the outside world. Without Max, he would have walked past it without ever knowing it existed. The German Shepherd calmly sat in front of the door. Then he looked up at Daniel, waiting. Daniel rested one hand on the cold iron lock. The metal flaked beneath his fingers. He spoke almost in a whisper. "How long has this place been forgotten?" A cool breeze swept through the trees. Somewhere behind the cabin, an old wooden shutter slowly tapped against the wall. Knock. Knock. The sound echoed through the silent forest. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He looked at Max. The German Shepherd never took his eyes off the door. After a long moment of silence, Daniel reached into his belt pouch and pulled out his multi-tool. "If no one has entered this cabin for decades, today may be the day that changes." He reached toward the ancient lock. Daniel studied the old iron lock for a long moment. Rust covered every inch of its surface, but despite decades of exposure to rain, snow, and freezing winters, the lock was still intact. He gently pushed the wooden door. It didn't move. Max stood quietly beside him, watching every motion. Daniel removed a small bottle of lubricant from his backpack and sprayed the hinges and lock. He waited a few moments before inserting his multi-tool into the rusted mechanism. A soft click echoed through the silent forest. The lock released. Daniel looked at Max. "Ready." The German shepherd slowly wagged his tail. Together they pushed against the heavy door. Creak. The sound of old wood echoed through the cabin as the door slowly swung inward for what might have been the first time in 70 years. A cool wave of stale air drifted outside. Dust floated through the beams of sunlight pouring in from the doorway. Daniel waited several seconds before stepping inside. The cabin was surprisingly well preserved. A stone fireplace stood against the far wall. A wooden table remained in the center of the room. 2 handmade chairs still faced each other. Shelves lined one wall holding old tin cups, glass jars, and weathered cooking tools. Everything was coated with a thick layer of dust. It looked as though someone had simply walked away one afternoon and never returned. Daniel slowly swept his flashlight across the room. Nothing appeared disturbed. No broken furniture. No signs of vandalism. No footprints except their own. Max entered quietly. Instead of exploring the entire cabin, he walked directly toward the stone fireplace. He lowered his nose and sniffed around the large stone hearth. Daniel noticed the behavior immediately. "What is it, buddy Max?" continued circling the fireplace before stopping beside an old wooden rocking chair. The chair faced the fire as if someone had spent countless evenings sitting there. A faded wool blanket still rested across its back. Daniel gently touched it. The fabric nearly crumbled beneath his fingers. He looked around again. On the wall hung several rusted hooks. An old lantern. A cast-iron skillet. Everything remained exactly where its owner had left it. Then, something on the table caught his attention. A leather-bound notebook. Daniel carefully lifted it. The cover was cracked with age, but one word was still visible. Ranger. His pulse quickened. He slowly opened the first page. Most of the writing had faded, but one entry remained surprisingly clear. The 18th of May, 1956. Daniel stared at the date. 70 years. He carefully turned another page. Pressed between the paper was an old black and white photograph. It showed a young park ranger standing proudly in front of the very same cabin. Beside him sat a German shepherd. The resemblance to Max was remarkable. The same alert ears, the same confident posture. Daniel smiled. "You would have liked him." Max quietly sniffed the photograph before looking back at Daniel. Written beneath the picture in faded handwriting was a single sentence. "My partner, Ranger." Daniel frowned. The dog's name was Ranger. He examined the remaining pages. Most were damaged by moisture, making the writing impossible to read. But near the back of the journal, one folded piece of paper remained perfectly preserved. Its edges had yellowed with time. Daniel unfolded it carefully. Only one sentence had been written in dark ink. "If someone ever finds this cabin, please finish what I couldn't." Daniel read the words twice. A strange silence filled the room. Finish what he slowly looked around the cabin again. This was no longer just an abandoned building. Someone had left behind a message. A message meant for whoever finally opened the door. Max suddenly stood. His ears lifted. Without barking, he walked across the room toward the old wooden floor near the fireplace. Then he stopped. He scratched. Once. Twice. A hollow sound echoed beneath the floorboards. Daniel looked down. The wood beneath Max's paw sounded completely different from the rest of the cabin. He knelt beside the dog. "There is something under here." Max scratched the floor one more time. This time, the loose board shifted slightly. Daniel knelt beside the loose floorboard while Max remained perfectly still, his nose fixed on the same spot. The ranger tapped the wooden plank with the handle of his flashlight. Thump. Solid. He tapped the next board. Thump. Solid again. Then he tapped the one beneath Max's paws. Thunk. The sound was unmistakably hollow. Daniel looked at his partner. You found something. Using the flat edge of his multi-tool, he carefully worked around the weathered plank. The wood resisted at first, but after decades of shrinking and swelling through countless Yellowstone winters, it finally loosened. With one final pull, the board lifted free. A cloud of dust drifted into the air. Hidden beneath the floor was a narrow compartment barely large enough to hold a small wooden box. Daniel reached inside. The box was wrapped in an old piece of oilcloth that had protected it from moisture for decades. He carried it to the table and gently unwrapped it. Unlike everything else in the cabin, the box had survived remarkably well. Its brass latch was slightly tarnished but still functional. Inside were only 3 items: a folded park map, a small brass key, and another journal. Daniel carefully opened the map first. It was an official Yellowstone survey map dated 1955. Immediately he noticed something unusual. A large section of Black Pine Ridge had been outlined in red pencil. A narrow trail had also been drawn by hand. It led away from the cabin and disappeared deep into a valley that didn't appear on any modern map. "What were you hiding?" Daniel whispered. Max quietly sniffed the edge of the map before turning toward the second journal. Daniel picked it up. Unlike the notebook found on the table, this journal had been protected inside the box. The pages were almost perfectly preserved. He opened to the first entry, the 2nd of April, 1956. "If you're reading this, then you've found the place I hoped would remain hidden until the right person arrived." Daniel frowned. The words felt as though they had been written directly to him. He continued reading. "Most people believe this cabin is only a ranger station. It isn't. Its true purpose is to protect something far more valuable than these walls." Daniel exchanged a glance with Max. "What does that mean?" He turned another page. The next several entries described wildlife observations: large elk herds, golden eagles, black bears, wolf packs. Everything seemed like ordinary ranger records. Then one sentence caught his attention: "No one must discover the valley before it is safe." Daniel stopped reading. The valley. The same valley marked on the map. He unfolded the map again, studying every detail. Modern satellite surveys showed nothing in that location except dense forest and steep cliffs. Why would an experienced ranger deliberately draw a trail that no longer existed? Max suddenly walked away from the table. He sniffed along the stone fireplace once again before moving toward the back wall of the cabin. His ears lifted. Daniel followed. The wall looked ordinary: old pine logs, a faded coat hook, an empty shelf. Then Daniel noticed faint scratch marks near the floor. Not animal scratches, tool marks. Someone had moved something here years ago. He pressed gently against one of the heavy shelves. Nothing. He examined the wall more closely. One log was slightly shorter than the others. Curious, Daniel pushed it inward. Click. A soft mechanical sound echoed inside the wall. The bookshelf shifted forward less than an inch. Daniel's eyes widened. A hidden door. He carefully pulled the shelf toward him. Behind it was a narrow passage descending into darkness. Cold air drifted upward. The stale smell of old earth filled the cabin. Daniel switched on his flashlight. Stone steps disappeared below the cabin. Max stood at the entrance without barking. His tail remained still. His posture was calm but intensely focused. Daniel looked back at the journal lying open on the table. Then at the hidden staircase. Whatever ranger Thomas Walker had spent 70 years protecting, it wasn't hidden beneath the floor. It was waiting below the cabin. Daniel tightened his grip on the flashlight. Looks like we're about to find out why this place was forgotten. Together, Daniel and Max stepped toward the dark staircase. Daniel aimed his flashlight down the narrow stone staircase. The beam disappeared into darkness. Cold air drifted upward, carrying the smell of damp earth and aged timber. Max stood beside the hidden entrance without making a sound. His ears were forward and his eyes remained fixed on the steps below. "You ready?" The German shepherd quietly stepped onto the first stone stair. Daniel followed. Each step creaked beneath decades of dust. The staircase wasn't long. After descending about 15 feet, they entered a small underground cellar carved directly into the hillside beneath the cabin. Daniel swept his flashlight across the room. Unlike the cabin above, this place had remained almost untouched by time. Wooden shelves lined the walls. Glass jars still sat neatly in rows. A rusted kerosene lantern hung from a wooden beam. In one corner stood an old field radio covered with a canvas cloth. Daniel carefully lifted the cloth away. The radio was marked with the National Park Service emblem. Beside it rested a pair of headphones and a handwritten logbook. He opened the first page. The final radio entry was dated the 14th of November 1956. Heavy snowfall approaching. Communication becoming unreliable. Will remain at the cabin until weather improves. There were no more entries. Daniel looked around the room. If Thomas stayed here, why did he never return? Max quietly moved toward another corner. He sniffed an old wooden desk. On top of it lay a leather map case. Inside was a carefully folded topographic map. Unlike the one Daniel had already found, this version contained far more detail. Red pencil lines marked hidden trails through Black Pine Ridge. Small handwritten notes identified natural springs, caves, and wildlife crossings. But one location stood out above all the others. A large circle surrounded a remote valley several miles west of the cabin. Next to it, Thomas had written only 3 words: "Protect this place." Daniel stared at the note. What could be so important that a ranger would hide maps beneath a secret cellar? He continued searching. On the lowest shelf sat a heavy steel lockbox. The brass key found beneath the floor fit perfectly. With a soft click, the lid opened. Inside were several carefully wrapped documents: a silver ranger badge, a compass, a handful of black and white photographs, and a sealed envelope. Across the front, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "For whoever finds this cabin." Daniel slowly opened it. The letter was surprisingly well preserved. If you're reading this, then I was unable to keep my promise. Please don't judge me until you've seen the valley with your own eyes. Everything I did was to protect what lives there. Daniel continued reading. Many people would see only timberland or profit. I saw something that deserved to remain untouched. If the valley has survived, then my years here were worth it. Daniel folded the letter carefully. His respect for the unknown ranger grew with every page. This no longer felt like the story of a missing man. It felt like the story of someone who had chosen duty over recognition. Just then, Max's head lifted sharply. He walked toward the back wall of the cellar. His nose followed a faint scent to a narrow wooden window no larger than a backpack. Daniel brushed away decades of dirt. Sunlight streamed through the opening. Outside, hidden behind thick pine trees, he caught sight of something unexpected: a barely visible footpath. It disappeared into the forest, heading in exactly the same direction marked on Thomas Walker's map. Daniel looked back at the letter in his hand, then toward the hidden trail. He smiled. I think Thomas just showed us where to go next. Max wagged his tail once before stepping toward the path waiting beyond the cellar window. The narrow trail began only a few feet beyond the cellar window. It was barely visible beneath layers of pine needles and thick moss, as though nature had spent decades trying to erase it. Daniel unfolded Thomas Walker's hand-drawn map once more. The faded red line matched the trail perfectly. So this is the path you wanted someone to find. Max moved ahead without hesitation. His nose stayed low to the ground, following a scent invisible to Daniel. The forest became denser with every step. Towering pines blocked most of the sunlight, leaving only scattered golden beams reaching the forest floor. Unlike the park's popular hiking trails, this place felt untouched. There were no boot prints, no trail markers, no signs that anyone had walked here in generations. After nearly 40 minutes, the terrain began to change. The steep hillside leveled out, and the sound of flowing water echoed through the trees. Daniel pushed aside a curtain of low branches. He stopped in disbelief. Before him stretched a broad valley hidden completely within the mountains. A crystal-clear stream wound through lush green meadows. Massive, old-growth pine trees towered above the landscape, many of them far older than any Daniel had seen elsewhere in Yellowstone. Wildflowers covered the open fields. A small herd of elk grazed peacefully near the stream. Farther away, several bighorn sheep climbed effortlessly across rocky cliffs. The valley felt untouched by modern civilization. Daniel slowly lowered his binoculars. This place is incredible. Max stood quietly beside him, calmly observing the wildlife. None of the animals appeared frightened. The elk raised their heads briefly before returning to graze. Birdsong echoed across the valley. It felt as though the entire ecosystem existed in perfect balance. Daniel checked his GPS. The device showed their exact location. Yet, the digital map displayed nothing more than solid forest. No wonder Thomas wanted to protect this. He carefully photographed the valley from several angles. As he walked closer to the stream, Max suddenly changed direction. The German Shepherd trotted toward a cluster of large granite boulders near the edge of the meadow. He stopped beside one weathered stone and barked once. Daniel hurried over. Half hidden beneath moss and vines stood a simple stone marker. He gently brushed away the dirt. Slowly words began to appear. Thomas Walker, 1,924. 1,956. Daniel stood frozen. The missing ranger had never truly disappeared. There was no large monument, no elaborate memorial. Only a modest stone placed beneath the shade of ancient pines overlooking the valley he had fought to protect. Beside the marker rested a small metal container sealed against the weather. Daniel carefully opened it. Inside lay another folded letter. Its paper had yellowed with age, but remained readable. He unfolded it slowly. If you've reached this valley, then you've already discovered the truth. I was never protecting a secret for myself. I was protecting a home that belonged to the wildlife long before we arrived. Daniel continued reading. If this valley still exists, then please make only one promise. Let future generations see its beauty without destroying it. Daniel carefully folded the letter. He looked across the peaceful valley once more. Everything suddenly made sense. Thomas hadn't vanished while searching for something. He had stayed because he believed this place was worth sacrificing everything to protect. Max quietly lay beside the stone marker. The breeze gently stirred the tall grass around them. Daniel removed his ranger hat for a moment of silence. You kept your promise, Thomas. He looked toward the untouched valley, stretching beneath the afternoon sun, and now it's our turn to keep it. Neither of them noticed a small movement high on the opposite cliff. A distant figure was watching the valley through binoculars. Daniel lowered his hat and frowned. They were no longer alone. Daniel slowly lowered his binoculars. Far across the hidden valley, the distant figure had disappeared behind a line of pine trees. He scanned the ridge again. Nothing. Only the gentle movement of branches in the afternoon breeze. Did I imagine it? Max answered before Daniel could think any further. The German Shepherd stood ears forward, staring toward the same hillside. His posture was alert but calm. He had seen it too. Daniel quietly raised his radio. Headquarters, this is Ranger Brooks. Static answered. He tried again. Nothing. The surrounding mountains completely blocked the signal. We're on our own. He folded the radio back onto his belt and looked once more toward Thomas Walker's stone marker. The ranger's final letter was still in his hand. It deserved to reach the park archives. But first, Daniel needed to understand why someone might still be watching this forgotten valley. Come on, Max. They followed the edge of the meadow toward the opposite ridge. The valley remained astonishingly peaceful. A family of elk crossed the stream without fear. Several bald eagles circled high overhead. Everywhere Daniel looked, wildlife flourished. It truly was one of the healthiest ecosystems he had ever seen. After nearly 20 minutes, Max stopped beside a narrow trail climbing the hillside. Unlike the ancient path from the cabin, this trail showed fresh signs of use. Broken twigs, recently disturbed soil, a boot print. Daniel crouched beside it. The impression was sharp, only a day or two old. So someone really has been here. He photographed the footprint before continuing uphill. The trail ended at a rocky overlook facing the entire valley. From there, Daniel immediately spotted what the stranger had been using. A sturdy wooden tripod stood among the trees. Mounted on it was a weatherproof wildlife camera aimed across the valley. Beside the camera sat a waterproof notebook inside a metal box. Daniel opened it carefully. The first page surprised him. Instead of hunting records or illegal activity, every page contained wildlife observations, dates, animal counts, migration patterns, nesting locations, even weather notes. The entries stretched back almost 15 years. Daniel turned to the final page. It had been written only 3 days earlier. The elk herd remains healthy. 2 wolf packs successfully raised pups this season. No signs of human disturbance inside the valley. At the bottom was a signature. Eleanor Walker. Daniel frowned. Walker. The same last name as Thomas. Could it be? He searched the box again. Inside was a faded family photograph. A young girl, no older than 10, stood beside Ranger Thomas Walker in front of the same cabin. Daniel immediately recognized the little girl. She had the same eyes shown in a recent driver's license clipped inside the notebook. Eleanor Walker. She wasn't an intruder. She was Thomas Walker's granddaughter. Max suddenly lifted his head. Footsteps. Daniel turned toward the forest. An elderly woman wearing hiking clothes slowly emerged from the trees. Her silver hair was tied beneath a ranger-style hat. She stopped the moment she saw Daniel. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then her eyes moved to the journal in Daniel's hand. Tears immediately filled them. You found his cabin. Daniel nodded. I believe it belonged to your grandfather. The woman smiled sadly. Every year, I come back to make sure he kept his promise. She looked across the hidden valley. He gave everything to protect this place. Daniel understood at last. Thomas Walker had never truly disappeared. For 70 years, his family had quietly continued the mission he began. And now, that responsibility had found 2 new guardians. Daniel stood quietly as Eleanor Walker stepped closer. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of pine across the valley, while Max calmly watched the elderly woman. Instead of showing fear, the German shepherd slowly approached her. Eleanor smiled gently. So you're the one who found the cabin. She knelt carefully and offered her hand. Max sniffed it once before wagging his tail. He trusts you, Daniel said. She smiled. My grandfather always believed dogs could sense a person's heart better than people could. Daniel carefully handed her Thomas Walker's journal. Her hands trembled as she opened the weathered cover. For several seconds, she simply stared at the familiar handwriting. I haven't seen this since I was a little girl. She gently traced one faded sentence with her fingertips. When I was 9 years old, my grandfather brought me to the cabin. He told me this valley was the most beautiful place he'd ever seen. Daniel listened quietly. He said some places become smaller every year because people take more than nature can give. But this valley deserved to stay exactly as it was. Eleanor looked across the meadow where the elk continued grazing peacefully. He knew someday someone would try to develop this area. So he removed every official record leading here. Daniel nodded slowly. The missing maps, the hidden trail, the secret cellar. It was all intentional. Eleanor smiled. He wasn't hiding the valley from good people. He was protecting it from the wrong ones. Daniel understood now. Thomas Walker hadn't abandoned his duty. Protecting the valley had been his duty. Eleanor carefully unfolded the final letter Daniel had found beside the stone marker. I've searched for this letter for years. She wiped away a quiet tear. My grandfather disappeared during a terrible snowstorm. The official search lasted weeks. When they couldn't find him, everyone believed he'd become lost. She looked toward the distant mountains. My grandmother knew better. She believed he had chosen to stay with the valley. Daniel asked softly. Did she ever tell anyone? Eleanor shook her head. No. She promised to keep his secret. Every year afterward, our family returned quietly. We counted the elk. We watched the eagles. We recorded the wolves. We never told anyone where the valley was. Daniel suddenly understood the wildlife notebook they had discovered. Every generation of Thomas Walker's family had continued his work, not because anyone asked them to, because they believed the promise mattered. Max suddenly looked toward the sky. High above the valley, a pair of golden eagles circled together in the warm afternoon air. Eleanor smiled. My grandfather loved watching them. He always said that if the eagles still nested here, then the valley was healthy. Daniel watched the birds soaring effortlessly above the ancient forest. I think he'd be proud. Just then, his radio crackled unexpectedly. Ranger Brooks, do you copy? The signal was weak, but understandable. This is Brooks. Chief Ranger Susan Mitchell answered. We've been trying to reach you for hours. Your GPS suddenly reappeared. Daniel glanced at Eleanor. I found something important. I'll need a scientific survey team. He paused before adding, and historians. Susan immediately recognized the seriousness in his voice. We'll meet you at Black Pine Ridge tomorrow morning. Daniel clipped the radio back onto his belt. He looked once more across the hidden valley. Tomorrow, other people would finally learn the truth. But tonight, the valley would remain exactly as Thomas Walker had protected it for 70 years. Eleanor gently closed the journal. My grandfather waited a lifetime for someone to find this place. She smiled warmly at Daniel. I don't think it was an accident that Max led you here. Daniel looked down at his loyal companion. Max simply wagged his tail, completely unaware that his instincts had reunited a forgotten piece of Yellowstone's history with the family who had never stopped protecting it. The following morning, the quiet forest surrounding Black Pine Ridge looked very different. 2 National Park Service vehicles slowly made their way to the abandoned cabin. Behind them came a team of wildlife biologists, historians, ecologists, and park surveyors. Daniel stood beside the old cabin with Max at his side while Eleanor Walker held Thomas's journal close to her chest. Chief Ranger Susan Mitchell stepped out of the lead vehicle. She looked at the cabin in astonishment. I've worked here for 25 years. I never knew this place existed. Daniel smiled. Neither did I. He led the group through the hidden cellar and out along the narrow trail Thomas had marked on his map. Nearly an hour later, the team reached the overlook above the hidden valley. No one spoke. The breathtaking landscape below said everything. Ancient pine forests stretched across the valley floor. Crystal clear streams reflected the morning sunlight. Elk grazed peacefully near the river, while a pair of golden eagles soared high above the cliffs. One wildlife biologist slowly lowered his binoculars. This ecosystem is extraordinary. Another scientist quietly nodded. Some of these trees are likely more than 400 years old. An ecologist studied the untouched meadows. There are almost no signs of human disturbance. This valley has remained nearly unchanged for generations. Chief Ranger Susan looked toward Daniel. So, this is what Thomas Walker spent his life protecting. Daniel nodded. I believe so. The team spent the entire day documenting the valley. Wildlife cameras were installed in carefully selected locations far from nesting sites. Water samples were collected. Ancient trees were measured. Every observation confirmed the same conclusion. The valley represented one of the best preserved habitats anywhere within Yellowstone. That evening, everyone gathered outside the old cabin. Eleanor carefully placed Thomas's journal on the weathered wooden table inside. My grandfather always hoped the park would protect this place. She smiled softly. I think his wish is finally coming true. Several weeks passed. Scientific reports continued arriving. Every one of them recommended the same action. The valley should receive permanent protection. Late one afternoon, Daniel was called to park headquarters. Max followed him into the conference room. Chief Ranger Susan stood beside a large map of Yellowstone. Several park officials and conservation scientists filled the room. Susan smiled. I am happy to announce that the National Park Service has officially approved a new protected conservation zone. She pointed to a section of the map. The once empty space now carried a new name, Walker Valley Wildlife Preserve. Daniel smiled quietly. Thomas Walker's name had finally returned to Yellowstone, not as a missing ranger, but as the man who had protected one of its greatest natural treasures. The room erupted in applause. A historian then stood holding Thomas's Silver Ranger badge. For 70 years, Ranger Walker's service was never fully recognized. Today, we're correcting that. The badge would become part of a permanent exhibit inside Yellowstone's Visitor Center, alongside his journals, maps, and photographs. Meanwhile, the old cabin itself would be carefully restored. Not modernized, not rebuilt, simply preserved, exactly as Thomas had left it. Several days later, Daniel returned to the cabin with Max. Workers had already stabilized the roof and reinforced the walls without changing their historic appearance. A small wooden sign now stood near the entrance. Thomas Walker Ranger Cabin Protected Historic Site. Daniel rested a hand on the weathered porch railing. It won't be forgotten anymore. Max slowly walked onto the porch and sat before the front door, where he had first stopped only weeks earlier. Daniel smiled. If you hadn't trusted your instincts, none of us would have found it. At that moment, the afternoon breeze carried the sound of birdsong across the forest. High above the cabin, two golden eagles circled together before disappearing toward the hidden valley. Daniel watched until they vanished beyond the trees. Somewhere beyond those mountains, Thomas Walker's promise was still alive. And now, an entire generation would help protect it. Autumn settled gently over Yellowstone National Park. The forest surrounding Black Pine Ridge glowed with shades of gold, crimson, and amber. News of the remarkable discovery had spread throughout the National Park Service, but the exact location of Walker Valley remained confidential. Only a handful of park officials and scientists knew how to reach it. Protecting the valley remained the highest priority. One crisp October morning, Daniel and Max returned to the restored Ranger cabin. The building looked much the same as it had 70 years earlier. The moss-covered roof had been carefully reinforced. The weathered logs remained untouched. Only a small bronze plaque beside the front porch revealed its importance. Thomas Walker Ranger Cabin, preserved in honor of a ranger who protected Yellowstone's hidden wilderness. Daniel paused to read the inscription. It's exactly the way he would have wanted. Max quietly climbed the porch steps and sat in the same place where he had first stopped on the day they discovered the cabin. Daniel smiled. You knew there was something special here. Inside the cabin, several museum conservators had carefully preserved the original furniture. The stone fireplace remained exactly where Thomas had left it. The rocking chair still faced the fire. The old lantern, cooking tools, and wooden table had all been restored, without changing their appearance. Only one new display had been added. Inside a glass case rested Thomas Walker's journal, Silver Ranger badge compass, and the hand-drawn map that had led Daniel and Max to the hidden valley. Beside the display stood Eleanor Walker. She gently smiled as Daniel entered. I never imagined I'd see this place alive again. Daniel looked around the room. Neither did I. Eleanor carefully placed a framed black and white photograph on the mantel above the fireplace. It showed Thomas standing proudly outside the cabin beside his German Shepherd Ranger. Daniel studied the picture. It's remarkable. Ranger and Max could almost be the same dog. Eleanor laughed softly. My grandfather always said a good dog doesn't just follow commands, he follows his heart. Daniel glanced at Max, who was quietly lying near the fireplace. I believe that now. Later that afternoon, a small dedication ceremony was held outside the cabin. There were no television crews, no large crowds, only park rangers, scientists, and the Walker family. Chief Ranger Susan Mitchell stepped forward. For 70 years, Ranger Thomas Walker's courage remained unknown. Today we recognize not only his service, but his extraordinary sacrifice to protect one of Yellowstone's greatest treasures. She carefully unveiled a second plaque. It read, "Some places are protected by fences. Others are protected by people willing to place nature before themselves." For several moments, no one spoke. The silence itself felt like part of the ceremony. Then Eleanor approached Daniel. She held out a small wooden box. I'd like you to have this. Daniel opened it carefully. Inside lay Thomas Walker's original Ranger whistle. The polished brass had faded with age, but it remained in perfect condition. I can't accept this, Daniel said gently. It belongs to your family. Eleanor smiled. My grandfather wrote that someday another ranger would continue what he started. She looked down at Max. I think he already has. Daniel closed the box slowly. I'll take good care of it. As the ceremony ended, the guests quietly returned to their vehicles. The forest gradually became peaceful once more. Daniel and Max stayed behind. Together, they walked to the overlook above Walker Valley. Far below, elk grazed peacefully across the meadow. A pair of wolves crossed the edge of the forest before disappearing into the trees. High above them, two golden eagles glided across the blue autumn sky. Daniel rested one hand on Max's neck. Some discoveries change maps. He smiled as he looked across the untouched valley. But this one changed people. The gentle wind carried the scent of pine through the mountains. 70 years earlier, one ranger had trusted that someone would someday finish his mission. Standing beside his faithful German shepherd, Daniel realized that promise had finally been fulfilled. Autumn painted Yellowstone National Park in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Nearly 2 months had passed since Daniel Brooks and Max discovered the forgotten ranger cabin hidden deep within Black Pine Ridge. Life had returned to normal. Daniel and Max resumed their daily patrols, helping visitors, monitoring wildlife, and protecting the wilderness they loved. Yet one place had changed forever. The old cabin was no longer lost. It had been carefully preserved as a historic ranger site, while the hidden valley remained a protected conservation area known only to park staff and scientists. One quiet afternoon, Daniel and Max returned for one final visit. The cabin stood peacefully beneath the towering pines. Its weathered logs had been reinforced, but nothing about its appearance had changed. A small wooden sign rested beside the porch. Thomas Walker Ranger Cabin, preserved for future generations. Daniel smiled. I think you'd approve, Thomas. Max slowly climbed onto the porch and sat in the exact place where he had first stopped weeks earlier. It was almost as if he remembered everything. Daniel stepped inside. The cabin was silent. The stone fireplace, the rocking chair, and the wooden table remained exactly where Thomas Walker had left them 70 years before. Only one new addition had been made. Above the fireplace hung the black and white photograph of Thomas standing proudly beside his German Shepherd Ranger. Daniel studied the picture for a long moment. So much time, yet nothing important was ever truly lost. Outside, the afternoon breeze stirred the pine branches. Max suddenly walked to the doorway. Daniel followed him onto the porch. Far above the forest, two golden eagles glided effortlessly across the blue sky before disappearing toward Walker Valley. Daniel watched until they became tiny silhouettes against the mountains. He gently rested a hand on Max's neck. You found more than an old cabin. You found a promise. Max looked up at him with calm, intelligent eyes before wagging his tail once. For him, it had never been about solving a mystery. He had simply trusted his instincts. And because of that instinct, a forgotten ranger's legacy had finally returned home. As the sun slowly settled behind the mountains, Daniel closed the cabin door one last time, not to hide it again, but to preserve it for everyone who would one day learn its story. Together, Daniel and Max walked back through the golden forest toward their ranger truck. Behind them, the old cabin stood quietly among the ancient pines, no longer abandoned, no longer forgotten. Some treasures are buried beneath the earth. Others wait patiently in silence until the right heart is willing to find them. Sometimes, all it takes is one loyal 6-year-old German shepherd to lead the way.